I thank the member for Banks. The question is that the amendments be agreed to. I give the call to the member for Blaxland.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Piracy is a breach of copyright. It's the unauthorised copying, distribution or use of copyright material, and Australians do it more than almost anyone in the world. Game of Thrones is the most pirated television show in history, and last year Australians illegally downloaded it more than any other country in the world. According to data gathered by file-sharing site Monitor Torrent Freak, in 2014 we accounted for 11.6% of illegal downloads of Game of Thrones. In 2013, we also topped the list for pirating the Breaking Bad finale. 18% of illegal downloads of that show were right here in Australia. Why? Why is this happening? Well, there's lots of reasons, but the main reason is if Australians can't get access to the content that they want to watch or listen to, and they can't get access to it cheaply and quickly, then they'll find another way, either by using a VPN to access overseas content, or peer-to-peer file sharing, or accessing overseas websites like Pirate Bay. This bill establishes a legal process to block access to websites like this. Under this legislation, copyright owners will be able to apply to the federal court requiring internet service providers to block access to overseas websites like Pirate Bay, which have the primary purpose of infringing copyright or facilitating the infringement of copyright. Now, this is not unique. It's not new. 39 countries around the world have legislation that is similar to this. This bill has been subject to an inquiry by the Senate Standing Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs. It received 49 submissions, and most of those submissions were broadly supportive of the bill. But some do raise concerns about its reach, as well as the costs associated with it and its effectiveness. In relation to reach, there are concerns that were raised in submissions and are reflected in the committee's report about whether VPNs might be caught up by this scheme. The Minister has raised the same concerns himself. I'm glad that the committee recommended changes to the explanatory memorandum to clarify the status of VPNs, but they don't appear in the amendments to the explanatory memorandum that the government has circulated in relation to this bill, and so I ask the government to make a change to the explanatory memorandum to ensure that this occurs and to ensure that the explanatory memorandum is amended to reflect the concerns raised by the committee. ISPs have also raised concerns about costs and indemnity issues. Once again, the committee recommended changes here to the explanatory memorandum. And once again, I don't think the government's changes to the explanatory memorandum sufficiently address the concerns of ISPs or the committee. I also don't think they reflect the position set out in the government's own discussion paper that said, quote, rights holders would be required to meet any reasonable costs, end of quote. And so I ask the Minister to have another look at this. The amendments that the government has circulated also do not include the 2-year review of this legislation that the committee recommended. And so when the Minister speaks in reply later in this debate, I ask him to make a commitment to do this as well. Deputy Speaker, piracy is illegal. If this legislation helps to reduce piracy, then that is a good thing. But there's still good reason to be sceptical about how effective it might be. There's lots of evidence that site-blocking legislation can have an impact, but sometimes that impact is temporary. Sites that have been blocked often disappear for a while and then reappear down the track under a different domain name or web address. The Minister for Communications has made this point himself. On the 10th of December 2014, he said, and I quote, "If you're asking me if it is possible for, say, Pirate Bay to then move to another IP address or another URL for that matter, of course that is true," end of quote. And we've seen evidence overseas that that is what happens from time to time. Last month in Sweden, Pirate Bay's official domain name was seized by the court, but as the Independent newspaper reported on the 19th of May this year, the people behind Pirate Bay have already said that it's likely to be able to get the site back up and running at an alternative address. What this shows, Deputy Speaker, is that to be effective in combating piracy, you have to do a lot more than just pass laws like this. And a lot of the responsibility for that rests with industry. A survey conducted by iView for Choice last year found that 50% of people downloading illegal content said that their main reason for pirating was price, and 41% said it was because they wanted specific content sooner than available in Australia. The take-up of services like Spotify and Netflix demonstrate that when people can get access to content cheaply and easily, they take it up. Last year, research conducted by Spotify said that there was a 20% decline in music piracy over a 12-month period. Netflix has had a similar impact. In April, Netflix's Chief Content Officer, Ted Sarandos, said, and I quote, "The real great news is, in the piracy capitals of the world, Netflix is winning. We're pushing down piracy in those markets by getting the access," end of quote. Netflix is expected to sign up 1 million Australian customers by the end of the year. About 6 million Australians have used Spotify. The take-up of these services, like Netflix, like Spotify, Stan, Presto, iTunes, Pandora, show that Australians want content and they're prepared to pay for it if it's cheap, quick and easy to get. All of these services are great examples of industry responding to the needs and the demands of modern-day consumers. But there's still more to do. On that point, it's a mistake to assume that it's just teenagers illegally downloading shows like Game of Thrones or Breaking Bad. People of all ages do it. Research commissioned by the Australian Performing Rights Association in 2013 found that 44% of people aged 18 to 30 engage in piracy, 25% of people aged 30 to 49 do it, and so do 11% of Australians aged 50 to 69. Interestingly, yeah, it's true. Interestingly, the research also indicates that the higher your income, the more likely you are to illegally download TV shows, music and movies. According to the APRA research, a household earning less than $40,000 a year is less likely to engage in illegal downloading than a household earning more than $100,000 a year. In his second reading speech, the Minister for Communications also mentioned an education notice scheme that's being developed by ISPs and copyright holders that will warn people who have allegedly pirated copyright material and give them information about legitimate alternatives. This has now been developed into a code of practice and is currently being considered by ACMA. The good news is that it does not look as bad as some people feared it would. The government discussion paper that was released in July last year canvassed the US copyright alert system, which involved ISPs slowing down the internet speed of their customers or cutting off their access to the internet altogether. A similar system operates in South Korea. There have been people in this government and in industry that have been keen for Australia to adopt this approach. I'm glad that we are not. The bad news is that it's still unclear who will pay for the cost of operating this scheme, how much rights holders will pay to operate it, how much ISPs will pay, and how much this will add to the internet bills of Australians who don't illegally download. Deputy Speaker, I also want to draw the House's attention to the failure of this government to do anything to address the recommendations of this report, Copyright and the Digital Economy, the final report by the Australian Law Reform Commission, dated November 2013 and released by the Attorney-General, I think, in February of 2014, almost a year and a half ago. It's a very important report. It includes all up 30 recommendations, and the bill that we are debating here tonight is an amendment to the Copyright Act, and it doesn't respond to any of the recommendations in this report. The key recommendation in the ALRC's report is not this. It's not site blocking. It's the creation of a fair use exemption. The Law Reform Commission argues that this would, quote, make Australia a more attractive market for technology investment and innovation, end of quote. When I was in Silicon Valley last year, I heard much the same thing from my conversations with people at Google, at Amazon and at Yahoo. All of them told me that laws like this, fair use exemptions to copyright legislation, helped to facilitate the development of things like search engines and cloud computing. And what are we doing to implement these reforms here? Well, nothing. The report has now been gathering dust for almost 18 months, and the only change that this government has brought forward to copyright law is this legislation that we're debating here tonight. It's the same with this report, Deputy Speaker. At what cost? IT pricing and the Australia tax, which is a report of the House of Representatives Standing Committee on Infrastructure and Communications dated July 2013. This report made another problem clear, and that is that we pay more for IT products than people do in many other countries around the world. Often, we pay 50 or 100% more than people pay overseas. And that includes everything from music to games, software and hardware. Incredibly, it's cheaper to buy a song from an Australian artist on the US iTunes store than the Australian equivalent. Now, the report makes a lot of recommendations, and once again, the government has done nothing about them. And that is why the opposition is moving a second reading amendment in this debate, calling on the government to respond to both of these reports by the 17th of September. And I encourage the government to support this proposal. If the government does not support this, then it will show very clearly to the Australian people that the government is not serious about reform in this area. Deputy Speaker, we do need to reduce piracy, and we do need to protect copyright. If this legislation helps to reduce piracy, then that is a good thing. But we need to be careful not to overestimate how effective this legislation might be. When I was a kid, I learned about piracy at the start of every video that you got out from the video store. It was the bit that you couldn't fast forward through. It's a different world today. The internet allows us to get almost anything we want at the click of a button. And when you have to wait longer than people in other countries, or pay more to watch what you want to watch or listen to, or your favourite music, or play your favourite game, then people understandably get angry, they get frustrated, and they look for another way to get what they want. Legislation like this won't stop that. It won't stop that in its entirety. Content also has to be cheap. It has to be quick, and it has to be easy to get. And that's a job for business, not for this parliament.
I thank the member for Blaxland.